On April 27th, 1946, a Tuesday, the city of Los Angeles dedicated a brand new village in the middle of Griffith Park. 750 corrugated steel arches stood in neat rows on the floor of an old aerodrome. Each arch had been split down the middle to make 2 homes. Each home had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a small patch of lawn in front. The rent was $34 a month. Within weeks, 6,000 people were living there. They named the place Rodger Young Village, after a young infantryman killed in the Solomons. It was just one village. Across the country, hundreds more were going up at the same time. This is the story of how surplus huts from the Pacific War became homes, and how more than 100,000 American families found shelter when the country had run out. To understand what happened in 1946, you have to understand what the country looked like in the months after the Japanese surrender. The war had been over since September of 1945. By the spring of 1946, more than 10 million American servicemen had been demobilized. Most of them came home expecting to do what soldiers in every previous war had done. They expected to walk back into a house, marry their sweetheart, start a family, and pick up where they had left off. The houses weren't there. For 5 years, almost no homes had been built in America. The Great Depression had killed residential construction in the 1930s. Pearl Harbor had finished it off. By 1942, lumber, copper, steel, and labor were all rationed for the war effort. Across the United States, fewer than 100,000 new homes a year were going up, and that was a country growing by more than 1 million people a year. When the soldiers came back, they discovered a country that had quietly run out of housing. Young couples moved in with their parents. Families of 5 lived in single rented rooms. Veterans slept in cars, in tents pitched in city parks, in spare attics, in train station waiting rooms. In Chicago and Detroit, working men were renting beds in shifts. 8 hours of sleep, then out so the next worker could have the mattress. The American Legion documented thousands of veteran families crowded into single rooms. Newspapers ran daily stories of discharged servicemen who had won a war and come home to nowhere. The shortage was so severe that Congress, on May 22, 1946, declared a national housing emergency. President Harry Truman appointed a special officer to handle it, a man named Wilson Wyatt, the former mayor of Louisville, Kentucky. Wyatt was given the title Housing Expediter, and he was given powers no civilian had held since the war. Wyatt sat down with his staff in Washington and ran the numbers. The country needed 3 million new homes inside the next 18 months. A conventional stick frame house took 6 months to build, even when materials and labour were available. There was no possible way to build 3 million houses by conventional means. So Wyatt looked at what was available right then on military bases across the country and overseas. He found warehouses full of war surplus, trucks, trailers, prefabricated barracks, steel panels, and one structure in particular that seemed almost designed for the moment. A half-cylinder of corrugated steel, 20 feet wide and 48 feet long, roughly the floor area of a modern small home, engineered to be assembled by 10 men in a single day, designed to ship flat and erect anywhere, built by the tens of thousands during the war and now sitting unused at depots from Davisville to Honolulu, the Quonset hut. Wyatt did not invent the idea of using Quonsets as housing. The Federal Public Housing Authority had been quietly transferring them to civilian use since late 1945, and the architect Robert Moses had already begun planning Quonset villages in New York City. But Wyatt put the federal weight behind the program. He directed cities and universities to take what they needed. He cleared the regulatory paths. He pushed the surplus. By the summer of 1946, Quonset huts were rolling out of military depots by the thousand. The numbers were extraordinary. The Navy and the Army had built more than 170,000 Quonset huts during the war. They had used them everywhere: Aleutian airfields, Pacific atolls, the deserts of North Africa, the forests of Belgium. Most of them were now obsolete or unneeded. The military wanted them off the books. The American public needed shelter. The match was almost too easy. In the spring of 1946, the city and county of Los Angeles each received 1,500 Quonset huts as part of the federal program. New York City got its allocation through Robert Moses, who set aside the former Holmes Airport in Queens for what would become a complex of more than 1,800 huts. Milwaukee took 850 barracks and Quonsets, plus 100 prefabricated houses. Smaller cities, Whittier in California, St. Louis Park in Minnesota, the Bronx in New York, each received batches of a few hundred huts. The huts moved by rail, by truck, and on Liberty ships from Pacific bases back to West Coast ports. And once they arrived, they were assembled at speed by teams that often included veterans themselves, hired by the new housing authorities to put up the buildings they would soon live inside. At Griffith Park in Los Angeles, the work began in early March of 1946. By March 19th, a Los Angeles Times photograph shows 185 huts already standing on the floor of the old aerodrome. By late April, 750 huts were complete and the first families were moving in, just over 2 months from empty field to dedicated village. The huts were placed on concrete slabs. The slabs were poured by crews running parallel to the assembly teams, so that by the time one row of foundations had cured, another row of arches was being bolted on top. Each hut was then split lengthwise with an interior wall, creating 2 mirror image apartments. Each apartment had a small kitchen, a bathroom, 2 bedrooms, and a living area. Plumbing was tied to a central system. Electricity was wired in by union electricians under city contract. The cost was the part that made every other post-war housing solution look generous. A surplus Quonset hut cost the federal government about $1,000 to recover and ship to its destination. Concrete, plumbing, wiring, and finishing brought the total to roughly $2,000 per 2-family unit. That worked out to about $1,000 per family for a complete home with running water and electricity, ready to occupy in a single afternoon. A new conventional home in 1946 cost about $5,000 before land. The Quonset solution came in at a fraction of the price, and it could be put together in weeks. That economics made the program possible. But the engineering made it work, because what Wyatt and the cities had bought, they discovered, was not just a building. It was a kit. The Quonset hut had been designed in the spring of 1941 by an engineer named Peter de Jong and an architect named Otto Brandenberger, working under contract to the United States Navy at a small naval base on the Rhode Island coast. The design brief had been impossible, a building that 10 untrained men could put together in a single day, light enough to ship, tough enough to survive a hurricane, cheap enough to build by the thousand. De Jong and Brandenberger met all 4 requirements with one shape, the arch. A half-cylinder of corrugated steel, supported by curved ribs and bolted to a wooden floor. No interior columns, no load-bearing walls. The shell was the structure. The arch did the heavy lifting. Weight pushing down on a flat roof concentrates at the corners and forces engineers to add trusses, rafters, and supports. Weight pushing down on a curve gets redirected outward and downward, spreading across the entire shell. Every inch of an arched roof shares the load. The Romans had used the principle for 2,000 years. The Quonset hut applied it to corrugated steel. Corrugation added the second piece, The ridges running along each panel made it stiff in one direction while keeping it flexible in the other. A corrugated panel resists bending where you don't want it to bend, but rolls easily into the curve where you do want it to. The combination of arch shape plus corrugated skin created a building that was stronger than its parts had any right to be. But the genius of the design for what came next was in the assembly. Every Quonset shipped as a kit. Curved steel ribs in bundles, corrugated panels strapped together, plywood floor sections in standard sizes, doors, windows, end wall panels, hinges, and bolts in clearly labelled boxes. A trained four-man crew could erect the bare shell in about a day. A larger, inexperienced crew could do it in 3. In 1946, that meant a Quonset village rose at a pace no traditional contractor could match. At Pammel Court in Ames, Iowa, the Iowa State College Housing Office documented an assembly schedule that produced finished apartments at a rate of 1 every 3 days. At Rodger Young Village in Los Angeles, crews completed up to a dozen huts per day at peak. At the Bronx site, more than 1,000 units were occupied within 4 months of the foundation contract being signed. This was not improvisation. This was the war effort applied to peacetime shelter. The same supply chains that had built the Pacific Island bases were now building college student housing in Iowa. The same crews that had assembled airfield barracks in the Aleutians were now putting up family homes in Queens. The men doing the work, in many cases, had used these huts in combat themselves. They knew exactly how the panels fit together because they had bolted them together once before, under fire, on the other side of the world. Rodger Young Village, the Griffith Park complex, dedicated on April 27, 1946, was the largest Quonset village in the country. 750 huts, 1,500 apartments, 6,000 residents at peak. Each apartment had a covered front porch and a small patch of lawn. Most had a young couple inside, often with 1 or 2 small children. Rent was $34 a month unfurnished, $40 furnished, in a region where conventional apartments were renting for several times that. The village had streets with names. Main Street ran the length of it. 2 former aviation hangars at the edge of the property had been converted into a market, a pharmacy, a barber shop, a hardware store, a movie theatre, a church, and an elementary school. The school had its own staff and its own playground. A village newspaper printed weekly. A village council met monthly. Residents elected their own officers, ran their own committees, and governed their own community. It was, for a brief few years, the most racially diverse community in Southern California. Veterans of every branch and every background lived next to each other, ate at the same village mess, sent their children to the same school. The local restaurants outside the village still practiced informal segregation. Friends from inside the village would refuse to eat at any establishment that turned away a neighbour. More than one Los Angeles diner quietly changed its policies in the late 1940s because Rodger Young residents had stopped coming in groups. Across the country, the same thing was happening at smaller scales. At Iowa State College in Ames, returning veterans moved into Pammel Court starting in 1946. They were assigned half of a Quonset hut on the north end of the complex. Their kitchen window looked across at a Quonset row that ran for 200 yards in either direction. The community had a co-op grocery store that opened the same year, run by veterans and their wives, selling everything from milk to clothespins. Rent was $25 a month. Most residents had a degree in progress and a baby in a crib. Roughly 1,500 veterans went through Pammel Court in its first decade. A great many of them went on to become engineers, agronomists, and university faculty. At MIT, the situation was different in style but identical in substance. 3,000 of the institute's 5,000 students in the fall of 1946 were veterans. More than 30% of them were married. The college built a new family housing complex called Westgate on the western edge of campus, 100 low-rise wooden units, and supplemented it with another 180 apartments built from surplus Navy structures shipped up from Newport, Rhode Island. Westgate West, as it was called, charged $45 a month. The buildings were Spartan but functional. They sheltered some of the men who would design the post-war American technology economy. In New York City, more than 1,000 Quonsets went up across Queens and the Bronx. In Whittier, California, a small community of Quaker veterans created Palm Village, 70 huts on the edge of town, each one an apartment for a returning serviceman and his family. In Minneapolis, a Christmas photograph from 1946 shows 3 veteran families gathered around a small tree inside a Quonset arch, the steel curving overhead, a wooden floor underneath, and a single oil heater in the corner. It was not luxury. The huts were noisy in rain. The metal walls were cold in January and hot in August, unless the inside was carefully insulated. Furniture had to be pulled away from the curving walls. Storage was tight, but every family inside one of those huts had a roof, a kitchen, and a place to bring their children home. The Quonset village era was brief. Most of the temporary housing complexes were taken down between 1950 and 1955, replaced by permanent stick-frame neighborhoods, university dormitories, suburban developments, or, in the case of Rodger Young Village, by the expansion of the Los Angeles Zoo. The huts themselves were sold off, scrapped or repurposed. Some still stand. A few Pamel Court Quonsets were moved to nearby farms and are still in use as workshops. The Iowa State Pamel Court Cooperative Grocery Building, recognizable in archival photos, was taken down in 1962. A handful of original Rodger Young Village huts survive on private property in Los Angeles County, still housing people more than 75 years after they were dedicated. But what those villages built, in the 4 or 5 years they existed, outlasted the buildings by generations. The families who lived in Quonset huts in 1946, 1947, and 1948 were the families who finished college on the GI Bill, who bought their first conventional house in 1950 or 1951, who moved to the suburbs, who raised the children of the baby boom. They were the engineers, the teachers, the doctors, the farmers, and the small business owners who built the post-war American middle class. The huts they lived in were temporary. The careers they launched from inside those huts were not. Wilson Wyatt, the housing expediter, resigned in late 1946 amid political fights over the program. He went back to his law practice in Louisville and lived another 60 years. He told an interviewer in his 90s that the Quonset villages had been the proudest work of his life. They sheltered, by his estimate, more than 400,000 American families in the years before permanent housing caught up. If you found something here you didn't know before, hit subscribe. We dig into forgotten frontier knowledge, lost construction techniques, and the old methods that built America when the country had to start over. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if you, your parents, or your grandparents ever lived in a Quonset hut, I want to hear that story.